Ian famously wrote at speed, like he would do all his books in less than 3 months in Jamaica. You didn't have much of a choice writing at speed, but were there any benefits to writing as fast as you did, or not?
I think there were, because you just get on and do it. And Fleming famously used to say that he thought a big part of the success of the Bond books was the fact that he had an adolescent mind. And I think what he meant was he didn't have that adult standing over his shoulder going, "Oh, that's a bit far-fetched, Ian. I don't think you could do that." You wouldn't do that in a proper book. But it was like, no, I want to do this. It would be fun. He wouldn't have said cool, but I will be cool, be exciting. And I was sort of in the same thing. I said, well, no, I'll just do whatever I want to do and just chuck it in and not make it too big and expansive and complicated, because Fleming's books are mostly quite short. They're quite to the point. As I say, you have that classic structure. Here's the villain, go and sort him out. And that's pretty much what he does. There's very little sort of twisty plot elements and double crossing and double agents and things. It's very clear and precise, and Bond is totally in the moment through that story. So it meant that I had to stick to that and couldn't go off on these kind of discursive bits.
With, like we said at the beginning, 2025 will be 20 years since Silverfin came out. So we're coming on for almost 20 years since you started working on Bond. I'm interested to know if the Bond in this book you've done now is the natural progression of your young Bond. Is it your Bond or is it Ian's Bond, if you see them in any way different?
No, I mean, the weird thing is, I always thought, having done the young Bond, because when the estate came to me to talk about doing the young Bond, the idea was to keep the timeline as far as possible linked in with Fleming's timeline in the books. This was the literary Bond, this wasn't the cinematic Bond. So my young Bond books are set in the early 30s, which was huge fun, and you can sort of create this fantasy version of the 30s to put these stories into. And I always thought that if I did an adult Bond, it would be a continuation of that, getting into the start of the Second World War, maybe showing how he becomes an agent, how he gets his 00 status, having to kill these 2 or 3 people he has to kill to earn his spurs. And so I always thought that if I did an adult Bond, that's what it would be. It would be, starting in the 40s. But it came to me, it was, no, this is going to be absolutely contemporary, because it's going to tie in with the coronation. It's about Charles coming to the throne. So I sort of had to throw out what I had planned for my adult Bond. And it was quite interesting, because what I had to do was to create, because Bond is pretty much always 35 years old. Fleming kept him 35 years old over the course of about 10 years writing books, which means that they don't add up. The backstory in the books is not consistent. If you follow the books, he bought his first Bentley when he was about 10 years old, which I did actually manage to work into my young Bond. And classically, the Bond actors in the films, when they start, they need to be about 35. Roger Moore went on, I think, till he was 58, but that was Roger. But no, and I had to think, okay, I've got to write now about a 35-year-old man in 2023, because Fleming's Bond is totally a product of the Second World War, and Fleming's idea of this type of new man, this new type of anti-hero, was based on the sort of people he knew in the war, and this new breed of agents. These sort of, a lot of them from a posh background, but were essentially quite violent psychopaths. And they went through hell, a lot of them, through the war, and turned into different people. And that was his idea of Bond, as someone who's been damaged by that. He's quite cold, and also has quite extreme views about nasty foreigners and things like that. It all comes out of experiences in the Second World War. But writing about a 35-year-old man today, they haven't been through all that. They're living in a very different world. And my oldest son is about to be 31, so only 4 or 5 years younger than the Bond that I'm writing about. And I think that people today young men have different attitudes, have a different view of the world. They've been through different things. So I had to make my Bond work with that, but still be recognisably, at his core, Fleming's Bond. He's a loner, he's tough, he's resourceful, relentless. Is to be able to reinvent Bond for each new generation while still keeping him recognisably Bond. I mean, in many ways, Roger Moore's Bond and Sean Connery Bond are completely different characters. You know, once you hit the 70s, you know, the journalist asked Roger Moore, how seriously are you going to take this character? Take him seriously at all? You know, this is a character who could walk into any bar in the world and the barman's could say, "Oh, Mr. Bond, how would you like your martini, shaken or stirred?" You know, he said it was ridiculous, and it reflected the times of the 70s and how that things had changed since the 60s and since the 50s, which was what Fleming's Bond was a 50s character. Sean Connery was much cooler than Fleming's Bond in many ways. And then, you know, you hit the first wave of wokeness and political correctness in the 80s, and that is Timothy Dalton's Bond. Then you hit the 90s, which is kind of lads mag Bond, which is designer Bond, it's gadgets. I mean, you know, the 90s was kind of made for a certain type of James Bond. And then Daniel Craig comes, and the world has changed, and our idea of masculinity has changed. And Daniel Craig very effectively in the best films channeled that. And you know, my book, I'm coming into it in that world, but you know, and everybody is fascinated and waiting to see what happens with the next incarnation of Bond. But in the meantime, I've got my incarnation of Bond, which is
about what's right or what's wrong for Bond. What are yours? What's, well, aside from not having a child?
Yes. Yeah, well, you know, I think it does have to be a fantasy figure. I mean, you know, I started that process in writing the young Bond books, sticking to those few facts that Fleming gave us. My young Bond is a schoolboy at Eton in the early 30s. And Eton is a very strange place. I mean, there are some very enlightened people there, and some very enlightened and strangely modern attitudes there. But I should imagine that actually a schoolboy in the early 30s at Eton would have been quite insufferable. I didn't want to get into the realms of nasty foreigners. I didn't obviously want to get into the realms of making all the villains disfigured in some way. But, you know, Fleming himself, he didn't see, you know, the times were so different then. He felt that he was writing a very modern type of character. He was saying, the war has changed everything. We can't have these sort of cosy crime thrillers with the likes of Lord Peter Wimsey. This is James Bond. He's a fist. He goes in and sorts things out. And we can't have this sort of polite, slow, old-fashioned, courtly world. People want to get on with things. Men and women want to have sex with each other. Why do we have to go through 6 months of a lengthy courtship ritual and get engaged, get married before we can actually go to bed with each other? Let's cut all that out. Let's get on with it, with what people want to do. And he saw what he was doing then as quite modern, and in many ways it was. But a lot of it, you look back on it now, and it feels a bit brutal. So, you know, I'm trying to, as I say, to channel what Bond is, but take out the aspects which really don't sit happily with anybody these days. But you can do that and still keep Bond as James Bond. And I know I've said it a few times, but in many ways I felt that the Mission Impossible films were closer to what people perhaps wanted from Bond than, I mean, the Daniel Craig films, don't get me wrong, have done extremely well and have been hugely popular, but, you know, Tom Cruise, if he sees a tall building, he thinks, yeah, great, I'm going to climb up that. It's not, first of all, I'm going to have a moment of introspection and call my girlfriend and maybe have a shower with my clothes on. No, he's up that building and having a fight. And you can do that, and you know, there's romance in those films and there's action, and it doesn't need to get, as I say, I think, yeah, he can still be recognisably Bond, and you can strip away those aspects which just don't sit comfortably with modern people, including myself.
We've got time for one more.
I think his best written book which is probably my favourite, is From Russia With Love. It's the longest of the books. It was he sort of jokingly said, "Oh, this one's going to be a proper book this time." At the time of writing it was his kind of last throw of the dice. He'd written the books which had been successful. They'd done pretty well in England. He hadn't managed to crack America yet, despite he'd written the likes of Live and Let Die, which was set in America in a sort of blatant attempt to get the Americans interested, but perhaps his gangster dialogue didn't go down that well over then, shall we say? And he knew he was before his time in many ways. He knew that unless these books took off in America, and unless he got films made of them, which probably wouldn't happen until they did take off in America, then it would just be another parochial little English crime series, 1950s black and white, real creamed hair type of thing, and would be forgotten. So he was really pushing right from the start to get Bond onto a bigger stage. He thought, I have come up with something here which is pretty extraordinary. And so he put everything he could into From Russia With Love and sort of said, if this doesn't work, I'm going to do something else. And to the extent where he actually kills Bond at the end of it. Rosa Klebb gets him with her poisoned toe knife. And the book did do well. And once President Kennedy said he had it on his bedside table, it became a phenomenon and not looked back since. So he really worked hard on that book to make it. And it's got some great stuff in it. Some great writing, some great passages, great characters. There are some quite dodgy bits in it. Kerim Bey, the Turkish head of secret intelligence, who Bond thinks is a really cool guy, has some fairly bizarre attitudes towards women, which I don't really want to go into now. But I think it is a fantastic book. And the thing about the Fleming books is that they all have, the quality does vary. Towards the end, he wasn't well. He'd slightly had enough of Bond. He wished he could kill him again, I think. But in all of the books, even the ones at the end, there are some amazing passages, some amazing bits of writing. And if you haven't read the novel on Her Majesty's Secret Service, it is one of the best. And some of the descriptions of skiing, which Fleming loved, are brilliantly done. He was a great writer of action. He was a great writer of things. He could put the reader very much inside Bond's head. And what is really interesting about this film, which we haven't really talked about, is how closely it does stick to the book. It's very faithful to what Fleming wrote, and I think it is. It's definitely in the top 3 Bond films. Inevitably, there is the controversy over George Lazenby. He only had one shot about it. Shot at it. How good was he? But if you've not read any Fleming, go back to them. Casino Royale, the very first one, is a fascinating book because you can see the sort of birth of Bond, and you can see Fleming coming up with this idea, and he's not fully fledged as the Bond we know now, but it's the birth of it, and it's a great little tight thriller. And as I say, if you're going to start anywhere, either Casino Royale, From Russia With Love, or On Her Majesty's Secret Service.
I think From Russia With Love is probably my favourite, but now yours is my new favourite, of course. So we're going to have after the screening, we'll be in the lobby. Charlie's going to...
You may well be wondering what on earth I'm doing here, which I've asked myself, but to tell you the truth, I'm going to say more this evening than I ever did in the film. Under my red wig, having really tried hard to do a good Irish accent, it never came to anything. But I have been entrusted this evening with reading you a letter that George Lazenby has written especially for you. It goes, I'd read the Ian Fleming novel on Her Majesty's Secret Service before I did the picture, because the director, Peter Hunt, wanted to be faithful to the material. I'd seen a few of the newspaper comic strips, but not really read any other books. I guess generally we were trying to keep to the book, especially the ending. I think we created a great screen moment. That all came from Fleming, even the title of the Louis Armstrong song. You've got to remember, I was a male model at the time. Everyone said I had the one thing that could make me think I could take over from Sean Connery: arrogance. And I did it. Oh boy, you did, George. I threw myself into it and never hesitated. Diana Rigg was hired to help me out, as I was an inexperienced screen performer. We got along fine. I knew she was going to help me through the film. We had chemistry. Diana knew her own mind. I was always glad of her strength on the screen. Telly Savalas was fun, but he gambled my per diems off me playing cards. I think all of us went a bit stir crazy up there. But it was fun skiing. We filmed that stock car chase on the ice, and I remember Diana really driving that thing like a race car, professional. But that was Diana, a professional in every way. There was talk of the time of filming The Man with the Golden Gun. I'm told it was set in Jamaica. I'd have preferred the beaches to the snow. I am told directors like Christopher Nolan, Edgar Wright, and Steve Soderbergh loved our movie. I'm pleased to have been the only Bond to have married. I thought that that was a great emotional core to the character, something I think Daniel Craig might have been inspired by. Sorry to laugh. I will contain myself. I've seen him say that in the papers too. My advice to the next fella to play Bond? Well, I guess one thing I'd say is, be your own guy. Be true to yourself. Reinvent it. Be of the moment like I was. The original one-off. I read somewhere that Ian Fleming's wife, Anne, and his son, Caspar, attended the premiere of my film in Christmas 1969. So I'm pleased Charlie Higson is presenting his book on this screening. Good title too. On Her Majesty's Secret Service is the only Christmas-themed Bond movie, so I wish you all the best for a great Christmas and season's greetings. I guess this crowd knows how Christmas trees are grown. I wish you all peace and goodwill. And we have, obviously, Ian Fleming Publications to thank for that letter, and, well, the manager to George, Anders Frisch, who made sure that we got this private and personal letter from George.
Yay!